Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Kadir Üstün. I am the research director here at SETA-DC. Today we are starting the second year of the Young Scholars on Turkey program. This program is co-sponsored by the SETA Foundation at Washington, D.C. and the Institute of Turkish Studies at Georgetown University. I'd like to recognize our Executive Director, Erol Cebeci, for his great input and direction this year about how to improve and take this program to the next level. I would like to thank our colleagues at the Institute of Turkish Studies, the former Executive Director, David Katıl, and the current Executive Director, Sinan Ciddi. They've given us lots of wonderful support for this program, and we appreciate that. As you all know, we claimed that it was a very successful program last year. We organized a total of 9 individual sessions and a conference in April 2010 here in DC. We'll be publishing very soon an edited volume based on the presentations of last year at the conference as well as during individual sessions. Bear with us, it's going to be coming out very, very soon. By now you all are familiar with the objectives of the Young Scholars on Turkey program. We invite scholars in their early careers to present their fresh research findings in a policy environment. While challenging academics, young scholars to think about policy relevance of their research, the program also tries to enrich the policy conversation on Turkey here in DC. We've selected a theme this year, given the spirit of the times. We named it New Turkey and the New Middle East. We have received many submissions from all around the world so far, but I would like to once again encourage all of you to draw your colleagues and networks' attention to this program and encourage early career researchers and academics to think about us and this program. Today we have with us Jacob Zen. His talk is titled Lessons from Turkish Civil Society for the Arab Spring. Jacob is a legal advisor for the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, ICNL. He received his JD degree from Georgetown University Law Center, where he was a global law scholar and a recipient of the Certificate in Refugee Law and Humanitarian Emergencies. He received his BA from Emory University. He received a graduate degree in International Affairs from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Nanjing, China. His publications on international security were published by several outlets: Jamestown Foundation, West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, the Asia Times, Hürriyet Daily News, among others. He's also a participant, a member of the Department of State's Young Turkey, Young America, a new relationship for a new age initiative. So we thank him for his being with us today here to talk about Turkish civil society. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the table over to Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadir. Thank you for having me over today. I look forward to speaking with you. I work here in DC at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, which in itself is a not-for-profit organization that works to enable open and conducive legal framework for civil society in more than 100 countries around the world. Not surprisingly, since March of this year, the Middle East and especially the Arab countries have been a key focal point of the work there, because with the changes going on, the governments there are adjusting their laws that govern civil society, In particular, the countries that have already undergone some form of revolution are changing their laws that govern civil society to laws that are more enabling of civil society, whereas countries that are afraid that the unrest will hit them are making laws to make it more difficult for civil society to operate. And Turkey is certainly ahead of these countries because Turkey underwent these types of civil society changes without undergoing a revolution by changing its laws that govern civil society in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and that's what I'm going to discuss first. And in doing so, Turkey's proven to be an exception in the region in that people often discuss how Turkey is a majority Muslim country, and yet they're surprised that it can also be considered democratic and secular, even though we see examples such as Indonesia that's also largely achieved this. But one of the ways that Turkey in particular has been able to create a proportional relationship between democracy, secularism, and religion is by creating an open environment where civil society can operate, and in particular, religious civil society organizations can have their voice heard in the public sphere, whereas in other countries in the region, for example, the voice of religious organizations was closed in the public sphere, and in other countries, sometimes they resorted to terrorism or violence, or there was large antagonism between the state and religious organizations. So what I'm going to argue is that by creating an enabling and more enabling environment for civil society, Turkey has been able to succeed in creating a fine balance between secularism, democracy, and religion, whereas other countries in the region have not, and how providing basic freedoms to allow for this vibrant civil society, inclusive of religious groups, has been a successful formula for democracy to take root in Turkey and continue in Turkey, and potentially for other countries in the region. Regarding civil society in Turkey, in the past 10 years, which is the era of change and reform in the legal environment for civil society, we've seen Turkish civil society organizations increase by 44% in the past 10 years. There were about 60,000 associations in the country in 2000, whereas now there are nearly 90,000. And if you include communes and foundations, there's about 150,000 civil society organizations in total in Turkey. And of Turkey's population of a little bit more than 70 million people, about 7 million people are engaged in NGO activities. So that's about 10% of the population. And last year, for example, in 2010, 3,000 new civil society organizations were created. And we continue to see a trend that more civil society organizations grow each year, and the space for civil society increases. There are also, of note, about 20 to 25% of the people in Turkey who engage in civil society are women. That would be about a little more than 1 million women are engaged in civil society in Turkey out of the 7 million people. 1.5 million. And one of the ways that Turkey was able to expand its civil society was by changing its laws and by engaging in democratic reforms in which the image of civil society went from adversarial, as it was when the country was largely influenced by military control, and people began to seek solutions to problems that they saw in society through creating civil society organizations related to politics, humanitarian objectives, social objectives, or educational objectives. One change, for example, that will always enable civil society to thrive was when Turkey changed the supervisory body from the National Police Department to local governors' offices. So before Turkey did that in 2003, someone who wanted to form a civil society organization would have to go to the National Police Department to register, and they would be supervised by the National Police Department. But when you're operating with a police body and the military, it naturally creates a more adverse environment for a civil society organization than when you're working with a local civilian government. So after that, more civil society organizations sought to register. But I would also like to say that although Turkey has expanded its civil society and we've seen significant growth, compared to other countries, for example, in the European Union, and its previous efforts to want to join the EU were one reason why Turkey opened up its civil society framework. compared to Germany, for example, there is one NGO for every 40 individuals in Germany, and whereas in Turkey there's one NGO for every 866 individuals. So we still see more civil society activism in a country like Germany or France or even the United States proportionally than Turkey. And it's also civil society in Turkey tends to be centered on the cities. More than 75% of the civil society organizations in Turkey are located in Istanbul, Ankara, or Izmir, whereas less than 25% are located in the rural areas where we might want to see more activism from civil society to address social issues there. And one phenomenon that we've seen since Turkey opened up civil society in particular is that religious organizations have become increasingly active. Before 2000, there was a adversarial relationship between religious civil society organizations and the government, whereas since 2000, or in the 2000s, the atmosphere for civil society has become much more open to religious organizations. So, for example, if you looked at IHH, which has been on the news very often, in the 1990s, it was very hard for that organization to exist, whereas now it can pretty much operate freely and it's become quite powerful. So some of the changes to the laws that Turkey made in 2004 that started this boom of civil society was that associations no longer needed authorization to receive foreign funding or to create partnerships with foreign organizations. So, for example, in recent years, in the mid-2000s, we saw a Turkish civil society and Armenian civil society getting together to address certain historical issues between the countries, and in the future we might end up seeing this lead to an opening of the border and a betterment of relations. That not quite happened yet, but this is one example of how the framework opened for civil society. Before 2004, when a civil society organization was going to have a general assembly of all its members, it had to inform the government, and the government would sit in on the meetings. But this type of intrusiveness is not particularly conducive to a civil society organization that want independence from the government. Governments could conduct audits spontaneously, which is also intrusive. They could find wrong information. Civil society also likes to retain its independence. In civil society, after 2004, when the new law of associations came out, civil society could open up offices in foreign countries, and even children now from the age of 15 and above now, in accord with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, could establish civil society associations. So basically the whole society was able to get more involved. But one of the main phenomena that we saw was that as civil society expanded and religious organizations became more active, the religious organizations, we were able to see that the AK Party, which came in power, was able to channel the interests of people affiliated with religion that wanted a heavy voice in the religious sphere. They were able to channel that through civil society while the state remained secular. And this helped also to curb fundamentalist tendencies by providing an outlet for representation of Islamic viewpoints in the political arena, while the AK Party itself did not have to openly espouse religious ideals, which would be contrary to the legal framework in Turkey, where the state has to remain secular or under the laiklik system. So what I see is that after 2004, there was kind of an increase in civil society with a bulge of religious organizations, and by allowing these religious organizations to become active in the public sphere, the state, by cooperating with them itself, did not ever turn, as some people expected, from a secular organization to something that would become an Islamic agenda, as they call. And that threshold is, I guess you could say it's rather narrow, but some of the telling points to show that the state has remained secular is that the government has never turned toward a religious book when it creates its policy. Never used religion itself as the basis for its reasons to make policy. It's never advocated, for a religious law, for example. And this is what we've seen of the AK Party. And in the end, the AK Party has remained a sort of catch-all party that catches the religious vote, but it also catches moderates throughout the country, and that's one of the reasons why it's been so successful. But we also have seen that as the religious organizations within civil society have grown, the relationship has become very close to the establishment in the state, And this can present sort of danger to civil society in that as the relationship between religious organizations in civil society and the state becomes very close, they almost begin to appear like government-organized non-governmental organizations, gangos, which tend to crowd the space for civil society, and that minority voices have a difficult time making their voice heard because the organizations that have closer relationships to the government crowd out the space within civil society. So this is what we've seen, but nonetheless, we haven't seen the state or these organizations that are closely affiliated with the state ever cross the threshold. And it is important to note that secularism in Turkey is not like the secularism that we see in the United States per se. Turkey's secularism is based on the laiklik, which derives from the French Republican era, in which the state, and in the end, actually does control religion in the sense that it imposes secularism in political and social life, but and this amounts more or less to the control of religion by the state. So I also like to think of it something like in Turkey, the something like religious law is for the individuals, not the state, and religious law is not a regime is not required for the state, and it's optional for individuals. But so obviously we've seen this civil society openness as we've seen religious organizations thrive in civil society in Turkey. We've also seen Erdogan and Turkish political leaders advocate this system to the newly emerging democracies in the Middle East. And when Erdogan was speaking in Egypt this year, he said, "Mübarek sonrası yeni Mısır'ın da layık bir anayasaya sahip olmasını tavsiye ediyorum." We recommend that Turkey go on the path of laiklik, we recommend that Egypt go on the path of laiklik, go on the path of secularism. And while Turkey disavows any type of neo-Ottoman model, it is appearing that Turkey is promoting this version of secularism to the newly emerging democracies in the Middle East, and the newly emerging democracies in the Middle East are receptive to it. The AK Party has already a strong relationship with some of the more Islamic organizations, and such as the Ennahda, or organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, while also we've seen in the Arab countries, minorities have also been interested in the appeal of statements like this to Erdogan. So as we look ahead to more changes in the Middle East, and we think about what type of inspiration these countries in the Middle East, the Arab countries, are going to take, it wouldn't be surprising if large sectors of the society want to follow the Turkish path. And one way that we've seen in Turkey that it's worked is by creating this open environment for civil society, where religious organizations are able to speak in the public sphere, and the state itself is able to remain secular. And this has created a balance between the state, secularism, democracy, and religion in Turkey, and it could very well do so in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, if they also follow the Turkish openings that happened in the mid-2000s. So, thanks.
Great. I have a couple questions before we turn to the audience. You mentioned IAH and their activism. How did that the incident that they were involved impact the civil society organizations in general? Has there been discussions among them about where the line is between activism and civil society, etc.?
So we're talking about the foreign policy. The foreign policy incident.
Sorry, we're pushing our agenda as a tendency to talk about foreign policy.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I think this touches on what I said about the gangos, or what we say government-organized, non-governmental organizations. Regarding that incident, the IHH in that incident was operating very closely with the AK Party, or at least close enough that they received sanction to engage in that endeavor. And in that respect, the cooperation between the state and the civil society organization was so close that it appeared to be kind of dangerous, and that one in terms of the sense that civil society or that one organization so close to the government could influence foreign policy in such a way. Whereas there could have very well been other civil society organizations that advocated for a different line, but because one is so close to the government, they can influence foreign policy and make such a big move that affects Turkey's foreign policy, not just with Israel, but also with the Middle East. So after that, we've seen more concern about the state and certain civil society organizations becoming so closely connected that they almost appear that they're one. And those would, of course, be the civil society organizations that the AK Party would favor, such as IHH and some other organizations. For example, they've gotten close with certain organizations that advocate for Islamic business, certain organizations that advocate for the headscarf, organizations that support the Palestinians, and this might crowd out the openness for organizations that have different minority viewpoints. And we actually have seen a little bit of a backlash from some minority religious communities, some Christian religious communities, or even some minority Muslim religious communities. So it's a little dangerous when they become too closely associated with each other. Yeah.
You compared the number of organizations in Turkey to countries like US and Germany. Could you give us an idea about what that amounts in terms of the Middle East, how that compares to the Middle East?
Right, yes. Comparing Turkey to Europe and the United States, it has less, proportionally, it has less civil society organizations. But compared to, and I don't know the numbers, but actually many of the Arab countries, for example, they have many civil society organizations, at least, for example, even in pre-Mubarak Egypt. But the areas where they were allowed to operate were very limited. So I'm actually not sure who has more, who has less. But for example, Mubarak Egypt, if you were a religious organization, maybe you could work in charity and giving out food. But once you wanted to enter something toward influencing the policy sphere, then you were shut down. That's why we saw Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, very active in the charity front and became very popular, but it wasn't able to be active in promoting it was very limited in what it could do regarding elections. So while I don't have the stats regarding numbers, in terms of the scope of where civil society can operate in Turkey it's much larger than any of the Arab countries. Although this might change as countries that have undergone some sort of revolution open up their framework.
Two critical changes you mentioned are the switch between from sort of the police overseeing the NGOs and then foreign funding being allowed. Are there other significant legal changes that were implemented that are helpful in growth of civil society?
Yeah, those were, I think the main change in Turkey was that whereas before in the 1990s and before, we saw a lot of state control over civil society or state intrusion into civil society. A military control of that sphere that would have been civil society. And there were just many different types of measures. Some of them that I mentioned is that I didn't mention were that before 2004, the security officers could enter the premises of a civil society organization whenever it wanted without a court order, and just to look around, maybe look at documents, see what they're doing. And that's very intrusive to a civil society organization that wants independence from the government. After 2004, they couldn't do that anymore. There were a lot of, some other ones that I didn't discuss were that the state had specific provisions to prevent students from becoming active in civil society after 2004. That was also opened up so students could become more active, whether religion or whether performing charity work. But I think we've seen growth and certainly in international connections between Turkish civil society organizations and foreign ones. In Armenia is one that I mentioned, and as I said, just the state has largely backed out of intrusive behavior towards civil society.
One last one. In terms of EU's involvement, EU funding for the growth of these projects, how much impact did that have, and how much of this growth is sort of indigenous?
Right. Yeah, I actually spoke to someone who works in civil society in Turkey about this about a year ago, and from what I heard from a direct source is that yeah, although EU funding has promoted civil society, it's provided significant funds to civil society in Turkey. A lot of those funds haven't been particularly well administered, and that might be one reason why we see not the ideal balance. This is why we see Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir-centric civil society organizations, and we haven't seen it go to some of the areas where it should. I mean, I think Van has about only 70 associations, and Hakkari has about 170. Compared to thousands and thousands in Istanbul. So it might not have been administered as well as possible, and I don't think we've seen as much growth indigenously as we would like to see in terms of, for example, the Southeast. And there could be a lot of reasons for that.
Okay, I'd like to open the floor to questions. Yes.
I guess I would say that a lot of very conservative think tanks in this town like to take the opportunity a lot of the time to, at any turn, kind of say, oh, well, this action or this, whatever it is, whether it was in 2003 when a northern front wasn't opened, or when just a lot of the moves of the AKP, that they'll go and say that this is a sign of Islamism, and they're turning away new foreign policy initiatives. That means that they're Islamic. They're not, they never say, okay, it's because they need foreign direct investment and they're trying to open up. But I guess my question is, Erdogan and the AKP, is that their support of trying to lift the headscarf ban and their work towards that, what would you say to someone who says this is a sign of the party's Islamism and they are not secular?
Right. Well, the funny thing is in Turkey, the headscarf is banned. Also in countries like France, the headscarf is banned. So by making it not banned, in a way, is making the country more, democratic. So it's hard to necessarily, put that issue with, growing Islamism. And there's, it's kind of impossible to read into someone's own thoughts and know exactly what Erdogan or what the AK Party will do or intends to do. But, there are some statements that he's made that would make me think that he does not intend to cross the threshold. So, to me, it's pretty bold that he went to Egypt and he said, don't be afraid of secularism. I hope that Egypt will be a secular state, especially considering that there's, a strong Islamic undercurrent in Egypt today, that he would stand up in front of hundreds of thousands of people and say something like that. Makes me seem like he's not the type to say that and then in the future not want a secular state. And I think he's comfortable with the position where the AK Party has close relations to religious civil society organizations, but he's able to operate in a secular environment for his own state. And rather than judging by what we surmise, if we look at his statements and his actions, he really hasn't done any actions to cross the line in particular. He's taken a unique stance compared to how Turkey used to take regarding Israel, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an Islamic stance, or the headband issue doesn't necessarily mean it's Islamic. So I'd say if we look at his actions and his statements, I don't think he's really crossed that line, and he's actually made some statements that make me think it would be less likely that he would.
Well, this gives me an opportunity to promote our Yusuf book from last year. We will have an article on headscarf, and there was a couple of presentations last year, so thank you for that. Others? Yes.
Kathy Cosman, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I was curious about your definition of secularism, because after all, there's active or, active secularism is the French, Turkish model, but there's also the U.S. model, which is, I guess one could call passive secularism. It seems to me that passive secularism might work better for Muslim countries. Of course, it would be too much to expect Erdogan to be promoting the American model of secularism, but it seems to me that it might fit better his actual political agenda in terms of enlarging the role for Islam in public life, which after all, doesn't allow, at least on paper. My question had to do actually more with if you could give us a better feeling for the range of religiously linked civil society groups. And also, it seems to me that one of the key problems of Laïque is that at present, religious communities have no legal personality.
Right.
So I don't quite understand how that then translates into civil society groups linked to religious communities are allowed to play a public role. I mean, it's a positive thing, but I don't quite understand how that works.
I guess on the first statement, if under Erdogan's leadership, the AK Party brought Turkey to a more passive secularism as opposed to active secularism, and then we saw religious blossoming because they weren't as restrained by the state, then it might lead these people in the U.S. to think more like what this gentleman said, that the state's now beginning to promote religion. I'd say that might be one of the goals of Erdogan or the AK Party, but maybe step by step. And I don't think that would mean that it's endorsing of Islamism. It would just be a different form of secularism. But it would certainly challenge the Ataturk Ataturk way, and that would end up, although it might be more democratic and be more ideal for his view of how Turkey should be, maybe this is something that needs to happen with time. But it still wouldn't go toward the Islamic component that he's becoming.
But
Islamist.
it still would allow the Armenian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox or whatever, or indeed the Alevi to have a larger life, a larger public life and legal life.
Right. So, I mean, I don't know.
Perhaps you want to try to, for your future research, you could comment about this as well, how you define religious organization, because there might be religious-leaning organizations who do charity work, and in their charter they don't pronounce to be sort of, doing religious work. But at the same time, you have legal changes are not, are tied to the constitution making, so a lot of the changes are not possible legally, but it allows the government to make sort of openings in, the Armenian churches issues, reconstruction of them, and etc. So perhaps you can either comment about it and tell us more later.
Yeah, please check the next edition of the book, and maybe that'll be a great topic to explore more. But yeah, it might put Turkey more in line with EU models by engaging that. And then just in terms of the range of organizations that we see in terms of religious organizations, we see like Gulen movement, which also has a close relationship with the AK Party. Schools across the world now, even in the United States, I think. We see, I mentioned organizations that promote Islamic business practices, Islamic education, headscarf. So you really see a whole range, Islamic charity, organizations that promote Palestinian causes. So you really see a whole range of these types of quasi-religious, organizations that have a religious element and then also, a non-religious charity element. But they all operate, pretty closely with the AK Party in this. But while staying secular, the AK Party can receive support from people that are influenced by these organizations. The party remains secular, and the party, by remaining secular, can still catch people that are more in the secular area. So that's one reason why it's been so successful, and perhaps a model for other political parties in the Middle East that also want to win elections, like in Tunisia. So.
One more suggestion, if I may. Perhaps you can also, you want to look in the article on how that affects other like non-religious organizations. Does that, the government changes, favors one or the other, etc.
Right.
Yes.
My name is Sarah Fisher. I'm with American University. I was fortunate enough to spend part of 2010 in Diyarbakir talking to civil society organizations. Cool. So the organizations themselves said that in the 1990s and 2000s they benefited from a growth in the number of organizations. But from 2009 on, there had kind of been three issues: less interest from EU in specifically the Southeast, the AK Party going back on the Kurdish opening, and these now existing civil society organizations that culminated in kind of an interesting political situation. So my question is, do you think the civil society organizations, specifically in the Southeast, but also throughout the rest of the country contributed to Erdogan's rapidly deteriorating relationship with the Kurds, or that they have also helped, or in some way helped?
The civil society organizations felt more restricted after 2009 and the Kurdish opening.
Not that they've necessarily felt more restricted, but on one hand, you could argue that the civil society organizations have helped gather people's complaints with the government and fueled criticism of it. In another way, you could argue that they've helped gather people and created a dialogue with the government. I'm wondering which of these, or another option, do you think is the case?
Whether they created dialogue or whether they created friction?
Yes, specifically in the southeast.
How did the failure of the Kurdish opening, if there was a failure, affect these organizations?
Right. I haven't researched that issue in particular because I was doing Turkey in general, but I do think the just general deterioration of the situation in the southeast has affected the numbers in general. I mean, we haven't seen as many organizations blossom. It might be one reason why so many of the funds from the EU end up going to the cities, because there's more stability there. And just when you have more military influence in a region, it makes it less likely that a civil society organization will take up a lot of causes. But I guess it's hard to say whether their dialogue, whether it was more about dialogue or more friction. But I didn't hear much about friction between CSOs and the government, at least until 2009. I mean, it seemed like the engagement was more or less working until things fell apart, and that might have happened for other reasons. But I do think at least in the 2000s, the dialogue was more or less positive between CSOs and the government. And I'm not sure how it's been since then, but probably not as good. And certainly with the actual political parties representing the Kurdish ethnicity, that's probably taken also deterioration. But at one point in 2000s, it was fairly positive. So.
Okay. Others? Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that the Egyptians can learn anything about getting the army out of politics from Turkey and getting them out of civil society and using them out of the economy, or is the situation too different?